Yeah, so I was asking you just earlier about the whole Bill Richmond because I said one of the more interesting talking points was the fact that his age, that he was able to do these incredible things,
Yeah,
what in his 40s and competing at a time where usually most people have retired by that time,
yeah,
especially in
yeah.
in the modern era. How old were you when you sort of competed, and what made you actually want to compete? Because some martial artists are happy to just
Yeah.
train and maybe spar in the gym and stuff, but not actually really make that competitive debut. What was it for you that prompted you to do that?
I think it was like early to mid 30s kind of
Hmm.
thing,
Okay.
somewhere around there. Actually, no, before. I probably started, yeah, about, yeah, give or take around the 30, some smokers, and then progressively up. And then I think I stopped in like my later 30s, something like that.
And you
And
started martial arts
I
in like
started martial arts when I was 17.
70.
Um, yeah. So it was in, I mean, I guess it's because, the competition part is where it gets scary. It
Yeah.
gets kind of terrifying. And I was interested in that aspect. I was interested in the how much of my mindset, how much can I perform when I'm terrified? How much can I do okay when I feel all this pressure and all of that?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I remember when I first started, boxing at my amateur club when I was, 15, 16. I remember one of the trainers said, "Oh, you see this kid here," and I said, "Yeah, I'd seen him, I'd seen him, perform on an amateur card." And he said, "Yeah, but the guy you're going to see in the gym is going to be different to the guy that you saw on the amateur card." And then I saw instantly what he meant, and I think that's very common. And I've heard many other people say this, that some fighters are, exceptional in training, but whenever it comes to being under the bright lights, they're just not the same person, but they're still very talented. But there is a definite mental aspect there in trying to overcome that, and it's pretty tough. For anyone that's not done, it's
Yeah.
pretty tough, isn't it?
Yeah.
Uh,
And it's funny, sometimes it works the opposite. There are people who are not that great in the gym. They are okay. And then they turn it on in a big way in fight time. It's less common than the other way around, where you look a lot better in training than you do in fighting. But it still happens,
it
which is
happens.
weird. I guess everybody's wired differently. Some
Yeah.
people are kind of mellow or super polite in training, or sort of sleepy, and then they really turn it on when it's time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that's most attractive as well about jujitsu as well. Is I felt like the community sometimes was a little bit different. It was a little bit more relaxed. It wasn't as, at least in my experiences, even though the training can be intense and still physical, I felt the characters, the personas, it wasn't as
Yeah.
sometimes, as dare I say, testosterone filled. Sometimes to say, it can be in boxing or in Muay Thai. I read as well on your profile that you've written a book as well about various martial arts. And what was your first exact martial art that you first started? Because obviously I know you've trained in quite a few different ones.
I mean, I started out because I was born in 74, so 17 I would have been 1991.
The
It's
year I was
very
born, actually.
Yeah, so very early in the game, and so it was back then. It was mostly you pick either Chinese Japan martial arts or Japanese martial arts or Korean martial arts. That was about it. And I started out with a few Chinese martial arts, and I was like played around with it. When I was around 21, I found one that I liked. That was probably it's all debated because the history of these things are always a mess, but like probably was a derivative of Choi Li Foot, and it was fun. I enjoyed it. I trained it. That was definitely fun. But then I started shifting toward combat sports. I mean, I did also. I think that's part of the thing. I like the range of martial arts all over the place for the things it gives you. Like even back then, and I still do today, I'll even do things like Tai Chi, which are at the polar opposite of combat sports. But I then started enjoying a lot jiu-jitsu, boxing, Muay Thai, wrestling, that kind of game.
Yeah.
And then just as MMA, it's just putting them together. And
Yeah.
So that I did judo. I did judo. I got a
which
black
is
belt in judo,
which is
among other
quite popular in
things.
Italy, actually, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
quite big
yeah,
in
yeah.
Italy.
Yeah, but I picked that up later, actually. I picked it
Yeah,
up more in the US. So
when you
yeah,
move
I did.
to the US.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I did, but yeah, primarily I would say, other than Chinese stuff, is Jiu-Jitsu, judo, and then I enjoy a lot. My striking is kind of weird. Like, it works in a non very traditional kind of way. Like, my boxing is super dirty boxing. It's just not the clean, nice. It's very. It's all kind of in the clinch, same as Muay Thai. I
Mm.
don't like the game outside. I like it more, which becomes more of a game of it's a mix of striking and grappling. You know, you're
Mm.
not just striking, you're also maneuvering, pushing,
Yeah,
doing things to put yourself in a position where they can't hit you and you can hit them. So
yeah.
it's more of a grappling oriented approach to striking.
Right, yeah, which actually works very well in MMA. And as you say, in boxing, sometimes it's the minute they clinch for too long, it obviously gets, split up and stuff.
Yeah,
But later, actually, I want to ask you about because again, in the Bill Richmond episode, you talk about how the fights sometimes were a little bit different back then. It wasn't quite, the cleanliness that they have
no, no.
today. But just before we get onto that, I just wanted to ask. You mentioned obviously, you're still doing things like Tai Chi and things like that. Now, are you still currently training in, for example, jujitsu and
Yeah,
in some of,
yeah,
yeah, you're still doing those things, yeah?
yeah, yeah. We do
Wow.
mainly jiu-jitsu, judo, occasionally a little Muay Thai.
Mm, fair enough.
Yeah,
Nice. And obviously, California must be a great. You're based over in California, if I'm not
yeah,
mistaken. Yeah, that must be a
yeah,
great
yeah.
area for Brazilian Jiu Jitsu as well in that part.
Yeah, but these days, especially after the pandemic and everything else, because I live in a really small town now. So when pretty much the only gym close by closed down, where I was
Oh
helping
no.
teach and stuff, I started. I have a garage. I have a bunch of mats. So I have like a few friends who come by and we train in my garage and we do it
Mhm.
that way. And I enjoy it that way right now. Like, I don't feel like driving forever to get to the
Yeah.
next town to.
Yeah,
So
that's the only other thing I suppose when it comes to the US is people forget, I suppose, here in you forget
distance.
how vast it is,
Yeah,
to
yeah,
get
yeah,
somewhere, Yeah, I mean, I live in London here, and if I want to train, there's hundreds of gyms to choose from, and you have the tube system, and it might take longer, in some places,
yeah.
but overall it's not a devastating, like amount of time. But obviously in
Sure.
cities like that, especially I think California as well, the public transport system might not be quite the same as say like a New York or
Sure.
whatever. But it's
Sure.
good that you've been able
Definitely.
to find a
Yeah.
home gym situation anyway.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it
So
works great.
and it
Works
works
great.
great.
We have fun. So,
So obviously, yeah. Well, I was mentioning the Bill Richmond thing earlier. For me, it was interesting because I put a little video myself about Tom Molineaux actually, and
yeah, yeah,
and the reason I did that is because when I was a teenager, I rented this book from the library, and the sort of preface of the book was about Tom Molineaux's fight with Tom Cribb, and
yeah.
how it was one of the biggest fights of the time and things like that. So of course, when I saw your episode about Bill Richmond, I didn't know the backstory, the detail that you covered, so that was really great to know. But I knew of the part that he'd played in Tom Molineaux's life, and and in his fight against Tom Cribb. What was it for you that made you pick Bill Richmond? Because he's a very specific character. What was it that drew you to him and made you want to do an episode on him?
I mean, it's a pretty crazy story. A guy who was born into slavery, who managed to get to the UK. There are debates about exactly how that happened, but it does, as still a young guy, managed to get to the UK, adapt to life in the UK, and then becomes a pro boxer in that context very late in life and is very successful at it. And also was a smaller guy, which was not typical back then because most of the main boxers were big guys because often weight divisions were optional at best. And so the fact that he relied more on movement, on defense, on things like that, that was interesting. So it was a great story. And
Yeah.
unlike so many other characters of that period, there was actually a pretty well researched book about him. So that helped, rather than having to piece information from like one article, another article. There was already a lot of background info on him more than on others. So I was like, yeah, it's a great story.
Yeah, I really liked, his sort of origin story, how he was, you covered how he was discovered by that sort of British officer who was a bit of a larger than life character, and then how he was living with, the guy who, again was, another larger than life character who sort of ended up having that duel, and even though him and his friend, there was all these other
Yep.
supplementary characters in the story that were very interesting. But clearly, as you say, I think he must have been a very special man, given the time and the circumstances, to have made it to those
Yeah.
sorts of places in society and to have been so well respected. And as you say, he must have been very good to have been able to. For me, one of the things that blows my mind is, you look at the fact that bare knuckle boxing has now made a comeback. There's now the BKFC, it's made a comeback, but you often see the fights. They get stopped very early. There's gruesome cuts. There's
Yeah.
nasty injuries. But one of the things I struggle to wrap my head around is how the hell were these guys fighting 60, 70, some, these kinds of rounds, for that length of time. Like, their injuries must have been horrific, but yet they would do this frequently, and I don't understand how they were able to do it.
I mean, I think there are two aspects to that. One is life was cheap, and that's, nobody was worried about CTE or long-term survival. The other is, I think if you're planning, well, there are two aspects actually, technically. One, if you're planning to go for a 50-round fight, you're gonna fight at a very different pace than if you're going for a 10-round fight or a 4-round fight. Two, the fact that you can clinch as long as you want means that you're not taking as much damage as because you're gonna spend a lot of time in the clinch. So those rounds are not like outside fast twitch muscle, hitting, moving back, and all that. Are going to be these slow, grueling battles in a clinch where you're holding, nobody's really hitting anybody else. Somebody managed to get a fist out and hit, and then the other guy tie you up again. And so I think, there's also that aspect that a lot of it would happen, would be a much slower pace fight,
Right.
um,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
in terms of damage. You're not gonna get hit as many times in a round as you would get hit in a round today.
Do we know how? Like, I'm guessing would it have still been 3 minute rounds? I'm guessing that would have been different in terms of time and maybe even time between corners. Do we know like how that would have operated?
One of the things too that we need to remember about that kind of boxing is that it was, there was no worldwide sanctioning
Yeah.
body. It was a very made up affair where, oh, we follow the rules of so and so kind of thing, and our breaks will be 1 minute. No, the break between rounds will be 2 minutes. No, it was the rules were a bit flexible in that regard. Like they would be part of a conversation of what rules you go by. They weren't always the same. They didn't stay exactly always the same in every situation.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because obviously, on that note, the big famous, thing to do with Tom Molineaux was the fight with Tom Cribb,
Yeah,
which obviously had a
sure.
very controversial moment that I want to ask you about as well. But before we get to that, one of my questions for you was, how important do you think Bill Richmond was? Because even today in modern boxing, the first example that comes to mind is Mike Tyson.
Sure.
Many people would say that Cus D'Amato was that father figure, that very important figure in Mike Tyson's life. Maybe Kevin Rooney as well, but I think Cus D'Amato was the early figure, and a lot of people sort of would say that post his death, things sort of started to crumble a
Sure.
little bit. He was never really quite the same. And, there's many other examples like it. So a trainer, coach, whatever you want to call it, is obviously an extremely important figure in a fighter's life. How important do you think Bill Richmond was for someone like Tom Molineaux? Do you think Tom Molineaux would have still had that success based on the raw talent without him? Or do you think he was a mega part of that success?
Hard to tell. It's very hard to tell because, the info we have is so scant that it's hard to tell. I mean, it's clearly played a role and had an influence. How deep that ran, nobody knows.
But I mean, linked to what you were saying earlier. So obviously, for people that don't know, what the major controversial moment was that when Tom Molineaux fought the champion Tom Cribb,
Yeah,
it sort of, by all accounts, it sounded like Molineaux was starting to get the better of him. Cribb was starting to
yeah,
tire, and then, for whatever reason, the crowd storming, it could have been very likely could have been because of the racial element, as you
sure.
said in the podcast. It could have been also because people often had money on these fights, a combination of both reasons. He ended up, I believe, with a broken hand and things like that, and he wasn't able to continue the fight. Now obviously a lot of people had a lot to say even back then, and
Yeah,
and people helped Bill Richmond actually get the rematch. He petitioned
yeah,
for the
yeah.
rematch. In general, that aside, how common do you think those guys? Because you obviously saying that there was no uniform. How common do you think that kind of chaos would have been in back then in those kinds of fights?
I think it was kind of the norm. I mean, because also you're looking at that kind of big boxing event was more often than not a very lower class type of entertainment where half of the people were all drunk, half of the people where there was no neat division, like the ring, the fighters would regularly end up in the crowd, and it was a mess in every which way. Then you also had, as time went by, the higher up, richer guys who took an interest in this. But it was still like it's the rich guys slamming, it's the rich guys trying to give a patina of refinement over something that was always considered sort of a barbaric lower class type of thing. And so the rules, regulations, things would change depending on which setting you were in. But in a setting like that, where you're essentially having a fight in a field with people right next to where, it's inevitably a mess. And yeah, people who have a bunch of money on a fight or things like that would play. You've seen that TV show, A Thousand Blows?
Yes, yes, that's really good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. It's
yeah,
really well done in
yeah.
terms of giving you a bit of a vibe of bare knuckle boxing
Mm.
back then.
Yeah, it kind of, if anything, it almost kind of had hints of that fight, with this guy
Yeah,
arriving,
yeah,
and then fighting the champion and stuff, and
yeah,
it had the
yeah, yeah.
it had hints of that actually, which was what
Absolutely.
drew me to the story. One of the things that I wanted to ask you is, obviously Tom Molyneux's life, for those that don't know, it was a sort of rags to riches, but actually it was more of a tragedy story. He had this incredible rise, and the rematch didn't quite go the same. It's sort of by all accounts, it sounds like he went partying and sort of was enjoying the high life of that fame that he'd attained, and the rematch didn't go the same. He lost by knockout, and then from there on, his life sort of started to spiral out of control. He parted ways with Richmond, and and ultimately he died actually very young. I believe still in his mid 30s, with kind of destitute, actually. And when I read sometimes, about even more modern fighters and stuff, you do sometimes see these great world champions and they end life. The great Joe Louis was another one that came to mind, and but many others, that will have had these successful careers, world champion, and then end their life in poverty. Do you think that was something that was still even common back then, given that most of where these fighters came from?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about, the fight business almost by definition is terrible for everybody involved,
Mm.
except the people counting the money in the back. Most fight today, let alone in the past, today most fighters are treated like crap. They make horrible money. There are exceptions, there's that like 0.5% who make bank. There's like maybe a 3 to 5% that's like, okay, you make a living. If you are really smart, you could save up some money. And then there's like 95% plus that make absolute crap and is never gonna go anywhere. Now, even after the ones that do make some money, it remains to be seen how well then you manage that. Because of course there's everyone else who's trying to scam you, from managers to promoters to everything. Unless you are particularly savvy, the odds that they may be able to scam you are pretty high. And then, as you say, some of these guys were being, in poverty their whole life. Suddenly you throw a bunch of money on them, they are gonna blow it in the most ridiculous way possible, and they end up with nothing shortly thereafter. So, the people who go through combat sports and do well financially for themselves are a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of the whole, of the entire equation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Which is sad. I mean, we mentioned Mike Tyson earlier. He was someone that came to mind. Don King
Yeah,
at the time had his hands in his pockets, and
yeah,
even more recently, there's been speculation about Floyd Mayweather and the fact that he's having to come out of retirement
yeah.
and things. Whether that's caused by finances, I don't know, but certainly some people are speculating that. But for me, it's interesting the division also in terms of the money between, say, elite level boxers and MMA, which is something that gets talked about. I mean, we had,
Sure.
recently it made the rounds that with Conor Benn leaving his promoter and signing with Zuffa
Yeah.
Boxing and getting offered this amount that really most of the champions in the UFC and I was listening to the Joe Rogan podcast recently where he was talking to Dustin Poirier, and he was saying, and even though he works for the UFC and he's a commentator, he rightly said that actually more competition, would allow because when the UFC knows that they have the monopoly,
Yeah, yeah. They pay you nothing.
it makes it difficult, what these guys did for the sport and the fact that they're not, and some of them I see, have to crowd fund sometimes for injuries and things, and that can be,
Yeah, totally, totally. I
you
mean,
know,
it's like my lady fought professionally in MMA, and she fought for one championship. And
wow.
so, big organization in Asia and everything else. And still you see I mean, like the people who make money, it's the same, right? The people who make money are 0.1%. Most of the people will get paid. Like you can't even, it's not even that you don't save for the future, it's that you can't even cover any expense for, not even for that fight, let alone for anything else. And this is high-end organizations, let alone the ones that are at the low level where, I mean, actually, entry-level MMA is pretty funny. Entry-level MMA, you have to pay to fight half of the times, in the sense that, they give you 30 tickets and you need to make sure to sell these super overpriced tickets to your friend and family to make sure that you have a fight that they want you there.
Wow.
So that's like the entry level. Then they're the level where it's like, we'll give you $200 and a beer. And then you go to, wow, you made it. We'll give you $2,000. And if you win 2,000 more, which of course for a fight is like, it's still nothing,
Yeah.
It's, or things like that, or
Yeah.
maybe slightly more. Like UFC, I think at one point they were saying UFC was like 12 and 12, like 12 to fight and 12 to win, which sounds like, oh wow, that's actually some real money. But when you think that, you have like at best 3 fights in a year, you have to, out of that money, you have to count manager, trainer, taxes. So maybe you made 50 grand in a year, and except that between taxes, manager, and staff, you're left with maybe 2,000 a month to be a pro fighter in top notch. Now it may have gone up a little bit now, but not that dramatically. You're still talking about people who, in many cases, have another job to actually pay for the fact of having a fighting career,
Mhm.
and their fighting career, and again, not a fighting career at the other levels in the biggest organizations there are. So it's a
Yeah.
joke.
Yeah, no, and absolutely, and you said 3, 4 times, if they're lucky, and that's if, because
Yeah,
some are only fighting, like once or twice, and never mind if they end up getting an
yeah,
injury,
yeah,
and then they
yeah,
can't, and now they're out for the next,
yeah,
year or whatever, and then they have no other way to to earn, and
no,
and then you think what happens that and for me, I remember listening to Robert Whitaker actually And he said, and this is something that seems to be recurring, I think, probably maybe not exclusively to fighters, but maybe successful people in general, successful athletes certainly. But he said when he was undefeated, everybody was around him. You know, everybody
Sure.
was his best friend, phone calls,
Yeah,
thinking, hey, we
of
can do.
course.
The minute he got knocked out, he said, by Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, he said the very next day, those same people disappeared. The phone
Disappeared.
stopped
Of course,
ringing.
of course, of course.
You know, and you hear that,
Yeah,
often,
yeah.
again and again from these people. And then it's like, oh, well, and I think, like anything, sports like that have a short memory. The
Yeah.
minute that you're gone, that's it. The fans move on, like and then you're by yourself. You've got to find something else because it is a short career. I know, sports in general are a short career, but I think especially fighting,
Hmm.
combat sports, the lifespan is quite short. It's not like acting or music or thingy where you can keep doing it until
Sure.
they have this short window to make as much as they
Yeah,
can, and then
yeah.
they've got to find something else to do. Now, yeah, maybe some of them go and do desk work at the UFC, where they cover, but a lot of them don't.
No.
And you have to find something else.
Yeah,
Um,
I think it's not really a career. Like if you're planning your life, I mean, unless you are this absolute god who has this insane natural talent and you can immediately climb to the top extremely fast. Otherwise, and even then there are issues, but otherwise, unless you belong to that 0.01% in terms of natural talent and ability to pick up things, and it's completely suicidal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, sometimes people look at Conor McGregor, and I think when he first was coming onto the scene, would have had a big influence on the sport. Made probably more money than anyone under the UFC banner ever did, and
Yeah,
granted, a lot of it was made from his boxing match and then his
sure,
whiskey and things
sure.
like that. But he kind of was probably the only person that ended up actually eclipsing the brand,
Hmm.
in the sense
Sure.
that, I would have conversations with people at work and, they wouldn't know what MMA is, but if you mentioned,
Yeah,
say, Conor, they know his name.
sure.
But as you say, that's the 0.01.
And even the Connor story is kind of sad because
Mm,
if you look at him early on in his career, he was wild, but he seemed like a decent guy.
mm,
He seemed like a fear. He was funny. His sense of humor was hilarious. He had all these things. And then, pouring a lot of money and success on him didn't quite. I mean, he clearly is doing more than well for himself financially. He has crazy money. But I don't know that that panned out as such a good life, in many other aspects. Because you see, I don't know, it's really a sad transformation the way his arc played. Because he was, everybody liked him. He was cool, he was funny, he was brilliant, he was really witty, he was smart. And then shortly thereafter, all those things left down, and you are just left with this trash talking mean guy who was just an unpleasant person.
yeah, yeah. No, I completely agree. Like that sort of, as you say, in his early rise, he was immensely popular and thing. And I think
Yep.
his troubles now outside of the cage and things like that have started to maybe almost overshadow.
Yep.
But
Yep.
I think that often happens. I think there's a lot of people that seem to maybe not be prepared. I said, well, I guess you can't
Yep.
prepare for that level of, and then that gets to their head and they're not quite able to, all of a sudden you go from what you were saying earlier, maybe coming from a very, underprivileged backgrounds, and now all of a sudden having everything you want. Everybody wants pictures with you. You're meeting all these people, like
Yep.
and it probably does take. I mean, isn't it? Was it Hagler that used to say, it's difficult to go for a run when you're waking up in silk sheets.
Of course.
The things that got you to the dance stop being
Yep.
maybe, and then I think the other problem it seems to be is they start to surround themselves with what they call yes men. They
Totally.
don't want to be told what to do. Now they're in
Yep.
charge, and and then before you know it, you start to lose the way. Or because I know we've only got 10 minutes, so I wanted to bring it back to your podcast again because
Sure.
as I mentioned at the start, like it is there's so much content there, varying different topics and stuff, a lot of interesting different topics. I mean, sort of done episodes on the samurai, on the sacred band from Thebes, and Bill Richmond, and all,
Yep.
all, all these things. What do you think it is in general? Because clearly that points to a long history and society of combat in general, not just
Sure.
combat sports, but combat. What do you think it is in general that draws human beings to combat and combat sports in general?
I mean, I think there are two levels. One, literally violence that has been such a huge part of human history, and it's not you can't afford to just be like, I'm just not gonna deal with it. I'm just gonna be pleasant. For much of human history, there wasn't a choice. It's like if your neighbors decide to invade, you better know what to do about it. Or otherwise, doesn't matter how nice you are or smart you are, you still get screwed over. And then I think there's something on a psychological level that deals with conflict. It's like combat is the rawest example of conflict you can think of. And we deal with conflict all the time. Conflict between our dreams and reality, conflict between who we want to be and where sometimes we feel to be the person, conflict. There's conflict in every aspect of our life. And so I think it's like visually seeing how somebody performs in a situation of high tension in conflict is inspiring to everything else in life. That ability to dig deep, that ability to face difficulty and hardship, that ability. Those are all things that are necessary, even if you absolutely couldn't care less about combat per se or will never be involved in any kind of violence in your life. You will still deal with conflict. And combat sports are one of the most dramatic visual representations of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely, you're right. I couldn't agree more. I mean, one question actually I had for you is: do you think, in general, maybe sometimes the classic historical books sometimes sanitize, the real historical violence? Because sometimes you hear things and that don't often get talked about. Like I was listening to a Daryl Cooper episode where he talked about a soldier in the First World War getting his legs blown off and then eaten alive by rats, and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you don't often sometimes read that in there. You might read about the battles and the victories, but not the raw violence.
No, it's horrific. I mean, none of that is pretty. If you think about, yeah, any kind of war, it's like there's nothing romantic about it. It's ugly. It's plain ugly. I mean, think about like so much of human history of just you grab a giant spear and you're gonna try to shove this tip of iron in some other guy's face, and and the other guy's trying to do that same to you, and you're, geez, talk about crazy, really crazy
Yeah.
situations.
No, it really is. It really is when you think about it. Obviously, of all the ones that you've done, the episodes of which there's a lot. What warrior persona, interests you, fascinates you the most, and why? Of all the ones that you've studied and covered.
I think one of the early ones I did a long series about was the life of Lakota leader Crazy Horse.
Mm.
And it's a great one. I mean, it's a very tragic one, but it's also a beautiful one. He's a very odd guy. He's clearly not fully like he does not fit even within the norms of his own society, and yet he's sort of the personification of the strong silent type who's just insanely powerful as a warrior. But also there's kind of the tragedy of it all is that on the battlefield he's an absolute genius. He's brilliant, he can pull off crazy things. And for all his powers, he cannot stop the larger forces that are destroying these people's way of life. His loved ones can't really protect them at the end of the day, even though he's as tough gets.
Mm.
And that's so it's both a beautiful and also tragic story.
Interesting. I'm definitely going to have to listen to that one then, and work my way down the list. My last question for you is really to finish it off is, what would you say the biggest positive is that martial arts has given you in your own personal life?
Yeah, so at one point I wrote a book called Not Afraid that's kind of about this stuff because to me it's partially is about martial arts, but partially is about life. outside of it. And to me, one of the things that's interesting about martial arts is that doesn't matter how good you get, you're always at some point or another, you're gonna get your ass kicked because that's just the nature of the business. Nobody wins all the time. It doesn't happen at the highest level, let alone at other levels. It's like, so to me, that ability to stay in a fight, in a highly uncomfortable situation, because anybody can, motivate themselves to stay in a fight if they think they can win. When it's pretty clear that you're not gonna win, that this guy has your number, that he's better than you, that you are gonna get physically dominated by this guy, either grappling or striking or whatever, the logical reaction is I want out. I don't want to be part of this. This sucks. This is not going the way I wanted to. To me, the idea of being able to fight on when hope has left the building is interesting because fighting when you have hope is one thing. Fighting when you don't have hope is a completely different psychological process. And I find it interesting because the reality of life is that in many cases, you're going to be dealing with hopeless fights. You're going to be dealing with situations where you're not going to get what you want. The cards are stacked against you. I don't care how many backbending miracles you pull off, it's still not going to work. And so to be able to maintain that presence of mind and stay with it when things are not going to go your way, to me, that's where the thing gets really, really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's an absolutely superb answer, and I couldn't agree with it more myself, to be honest. And I think it's exactly right, and it is a sort of metaphor for the things that you deal with. And I've often thought those things inside my head. I've thought, come on, if this, use this lesson. This has taught you things outside of the dojo, outside of the gym, to be able to apply in everyday life, and it's helped me and obviously clearly many others around the world massively, and hopefully many more to come. And
Mhm.
but no, honestly, thank you so much, Daniela, for taking the time to chat with me to answer my questions. As I
Of
said,
course.
I've got so many more to work through, and before I get to the Lakota one, but I'm massively enjoying it. You're doing a terrific job, and I can't wait to keep listening to more and to hear your upcoming ones as well, which I'm sure you've got many.
Sound
So
good. Thanks so much.
thank you so much, Daniela. Yeah, take care. All the best.